These are the images from the war between Russia and Ukraine.
We're getting new video of Ukraine taking out a devastating weapon that Putin has been using to inflict mass casualties on the front lines. You've heard about the thermobaric weapons from day one, but here you see Ukraine targeting a Russian multiple rocket launcher system that is equipped with those thermobaric weapons. And we've talked about them from the beginning of the war because they're horrific. They're banned under the Geneva Convention for a reason. They suck the oxygen out of an area. So if there is one that detonates, it literally rips the oxygen out of people's lungs.
Heavy fighting is taking place as Ukrainian forces try to repel the attackers. Charlie D'Agata went to the front lines where casualties are rising fast on both sides.
This is a harsh reality for many Ukrainians.
Urban warfare in Bakhmut. We see Ukrainian troops from the 93rd Brigade defending this battle-scarred city. They still hold Bakhmut, but there's street fighting now in some areas.
On February 24th, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine in a major escalation of the Russo-Ukrainian War, which began in 2014. The invasion has caused tens of thousands of deaths on both sides, instigated Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II.
The murky Kremlin-backed paramilitary group has been leading the charge in the bloody battle for Bakhmut, bolstered by convicts recruited from Russian penal colonies.
Штук 20 пролетіло, не видно українського герба, точно російські. Прямо над хатами. Прямо ось над хатами літають, падли. Полетіли в сторону аеропорта, бомблять аеропорт, чути, що йде бій. Вже штук 30 нарахував точно.
Many of you, like myself, might ask yourself, what is fueling the war in Ukraine? And I think in order for us to understand what is driving the war in Ukraine, we must go back in time.
We're not just close neighbors, we're one nation.
But Ukraine is a sovereign nation with its own language, culture, and political system. And while the two countries do have a shared history, Ukraine has fought hard for its own identity. Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries. In 1917, the Russian Revolution brought down the empire and the region spiraled into a civil war. Ukraine briefly gained independence from Russian rule, but was quickly taken over by the newly created Soviet Union as one of its first republics. Over the next decade, the Soviet Union brutally expanded its control, and by the end of World War II, it forged a sphere of influence over here, while the West held its influence over here, essentially dividing Europe and marking the beginning of the Cold War. The Soviet Union installed communist governments on their side, which were easy for them to control. But the West developed into democracies with capitalist economies. The deep ideological divide fueled distrust and tensions between the two sides, and soon these spheres hardened into military alliances. In 1949, these countries, along with the US and Canada, formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and promised to defend each other from invasion. A few years later, these countries joined the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact alliance, and each side built up its military to protect itself from the other. Europe remained this way for decades, until one side finally collapsed. By late 1991, republics like Ukraine began declaring independence from Soviet domination. The Soviet Union dissolved into 15 independent countries, including a much weaker Russia. And the Soviet sphere of influence disappeared as many countries overthrew their communist governments. Even though the Cold War ended, the alliance on the other side of Europe was still going strong. In fact, it was expanding. In 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO. In 2004, 7 more countries joined. That moved NATO into the old Soviet sphere of influence, making NATO's border with Russia the longest it's ever been. Belarus, Ukraine, and Georgia were now the last post-Soviet countries left between Russia and NATO. But Ukraine and Georgia both wanted to join NATO for a long time, and that made them prime targets for Russia. Ukraine became a NATO partner in 1994, which brought them a step closer to becoming a member.
Україна буде в НАТО. Це історична подія для нашого народу.
And in 2013, they reached an association agreement with the European Union. But when it came time to sign the deal, Ukraine's pro-Russian government refused. Instead, they chose to strengthen ties with Russia. After the decision was announced, hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets to demand the agreement be signed. After months of peaceful protests, the Ukrainian president cracked down and killed more than 100 people, sparking more protests, which eventually drove the president out of office and the country. This meant Putin was losing political influence over Ukraine, so he decided to use force instead. First, he invaded and annexed Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula. Then, Russia-backed separatists captured the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk and declared them independent of Ukraine. Since then, Ukraine has been locked in a conflict with Russia that has killed 14,000 people and displaced nearly 2 million. For nearly 8 years, Putin has held on to these regions, destabilizing Ukraine and keeping it from moving closer to the West. But in November 2021, Putin decided to go all in. Satellite images showed at least 100,000 Russian troops and military equipment piling up along the border of Ukraine. Putin repeatedly denied any plans to invade, but weeks later, he presented his demands to the West. His main demand was that NATO stop expanding and move its military borders back to where they were in 1997, away from Russia's. Western leaders rejected his demands. Instead, they put forces on standby and reinforced their military presence in Eastern Europe. Back at Ukraine's border, Russian troops continued to gather. And over here, along its border with Belarus, Russia began conducting huge military drills. On February 21st, the threat of war became real.
Считаю необходимым принять уже давно назревшее решение. Незамедлительно признать независимость и суверенитет Донецкой Народной Республики и Луганской Народной Республики.
His troops immediately crossed the Ukrainian border into Russian-backed separatist regions under the pretense of peacekeeping. Ukraine announced a state of emergency, and President Zelensky made a direct appeal to the Russian people.
Война лишит гарантий всех. Гарантий безопасности не будет больше ни у кого. Кто от этого пострадает больше всего? Люди. Кто этого?
In total, some 30 to 40,000 civilians have lost their lives in the nationwide conflict, Western sources say. In late July, United Nations estimated 18,000 civilians have been killed or wounded in the fight, but said the real figure was likely much higher as the war in Ukraine continues. For more TrottyKayvisuals, Be sure to like and subscribe, and most certainly leave us a comment. Catch you next time.